Vanessa Williamson recently authored a book called Read My Lips: Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes. She joins the show next to talk about how taxes became a four-letter word and what Americans really want when it comes to tax policy. So it's often said that tax has become a four-letter word, a dirty four-letter word, that is. And your research actually finds something very different, that people widely view paying their fair share of taxes as a civic duty. Tell me a little bit about your research and overall what some of your findings are.
So over the last 6 years, I've looked into Americans' tax attitudes, and I've looked at them in surveys, in interviews. I've looked at how they vote on tax issues, and I've looked at public statements about taxation. And I've just been struck by the extent to which Americans' views of taxes are just so different from the conventional wisdom. So it doesn't mean that people are necessarily happy about where they think their money is going or everything that's happening in Washington, but people see being a taxpayer as a civic responsibility, as evidence of being the kind of person who contributes to their community. And when you think about it, it's obvious. How often have you heard someone say, "Oh, I pay my taxes. I'm a taxpayer." So, and that commitment is a way of saying that you are the sort of person who gives back to the people in their neighborhood, the people in their community, and the sort of person who deserves to be listened to by their government.
And you actually point out in a New York Times op-ed that you wrote last year that just 3% of Americans disagree with the sentiment that paying their fair share of taxes is a civic duty. And you point out for reference that that's half the share of Americans who believe that the Apollo moon landing was faked. But part of what I actually would love to get into is you point out in your work that that the Boston Tea Party is often misremembered as an early instance of anti-tax fervor. You point out that that's actually not at all what the Boston Tea Party was about. Give us a little bit of a history lesson.
Yeah, so this is a funny thing. I think that, we tend to view history through the lens of the present, and so there's so much anti-tax fervor, particularly on the right in America, at the elite level, that we forget that history is often very different from our sort of modern concerns. So the Boston Tea Party is probably best understood as opposition to a tax cut, and in particular opposition to a corporate tax cut. Colonists in the United States were very upset that the British government wanted to provide sort of a special tax privilege to a particular company, a company sort of deemed too big to fail. And this was the British East India Tea Company. And so the colonists, who did not want to have their market flooded with this particular kind of tea that was going to come in at sort of below local rates of payment, they didn't want their market flooded. They didn't want a monopoly. And so they went into Boston Harbor and threw the tea into the harbor. And so what is, really, to me, if it has an echo in the modern context, to be a little ahistorical, it's much more like Occupy than the Tea Party, right? And for years, it was not even called the Boston Tea Party. It was called the destruction of the tea. So this sort of anti-corporate property destruction, it becoming a touchstone for the right, is actually extremely ironic.
And you actually got the idea to write this book and to do this research during the rise of the Tea Party movement in 2009. How did they take that sort of misremembrance of history and channel it into their movement?
So that's exactly right. My last book looked at the origins of the Tea Party and the effect of the Tea Party on the Republican Party as a whole, really particularly looking at how the grassroots and the elites and the conservative media work to push the party rightward. But I was at a Tea Party rally, and I was just struck by how often these people who were very, very angry and frightened about what they thought their government was doing, still regularly described themselves as taxpayers and really stood on being a taxpayer as kind of a public standing, right? That I'm the sort of person who the government should be paying attention to, and my interests are not being met.
So a lot of what you've looked into in your research is not just about what it feels like to be a taxpayer or the connection between being a taxpayer and doing one's civic duty, but also fairness. There's a big current that runs throughout your work of tax fairness, and that's a lot of what actually gets people mad about taxes. It's not, you find, how much they're asked to contribute. It's much more widespread that people get angry about the feeling that the wealthy aren't paying their fair share. Tell us a little bit about how that plays out in the conversations you had with taxpayers and in the survey research.
Yeah, so if you ask Americans what bothers you most about paying taxes, 14% say nothing in particular. about 3/5 will say either that corporations aren't paying their fair share or that the wealthy aren't paying their fair share. What percentage say the amount that they're personally paying? 7%, right? So that's a really very small percentage of the public who sees their own tax costs as the sort of primary motivator of their attitudes about taxes. And so what that means is that people aren't particularly opposed to the idea of paying taxes for public goods. In fact, people commonly refer to it, as a way of contributing to their community. It's like being a good neighbor, paying your taxes. But they are concerned that, this is an important civic responsibility that I'm fulfilling. Of course, the corollary of that is to be very angry when you think that someone else isn't paying their fair share.
And a recent NPR poll actually released just this past week really seconded that finding and put some updated numbers to it, finding that as many as 75% of Americans, and that's across the board, so that's going to include people no matter how they feel politically and who they voted for in November, but 75% of Americans believe that millionaires should be paying more in taxes.
That's exactly right. You can ask that question about whether people at the top should be paying more any of a number of different ways. You can call it heavy redistributive taxes on the rich. You can really push the language very far and still find large majorities in favor of raising taxes at the top.
Now, there was a moment in the presidential campaign this past year that really kind of brought all of this to the fore. And it was a moment during one of the presidential debates. It was between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And there was a moment where Trump sort of came out and bragged. He bragged that avoiding taxes, that figuring out how not to pay taxes was evidence that he was smart. He was literally bragging about avoiding paying taxes. And you point out and you argue that moment in the campaign really it symbolized, and I'll use your words here, a fundamental divide between President Trump and and he was then candidate Trump, and the electorate on a core question of civic responsibility. Yet he won anyway.
Yeah, one of the, on any of a number of issues, I think you could say that President Trump's moral standing is rather different from the average American's, and yet he still became president. The really interesting thing to me about what Trump said is it represented a break not just between Donald Trump and the sort of general American public, but between Donald Trump and previous generations of Republican leaders. It's been common on the right to say that, government doesn't work very well and to hold sort of an anti-tax position. Everyone remembers Grover Norquist and his sort of tax pledge that taxes should never be going up. But that didn't mean that Republicans typically said it was okay not to pay your own taxes, right? You'll remember that Mitt Romney got in a lot of trouble over this, right? His tax rate was comparatively low, and he insisted repeatedly that his tax rate had never fallen below, I think it was 13%, right? But he insisted again and again that his taxes weren't high enough to be acceptable, right? And so this represents a real break in the Republican tradition as well as the Democratic one, to this new stance of that, getting out of paying taxes is okay or even admirable. That is not how Americans have felt over the last 40 years, and it will be very interesting to see if Trump's attitudes change minds.
Do you see hypocrisy in the pride that President Trump takes in avoiding paying taxes and the strong drive towards we must be cutting all kinds of spending? And it doesn't seem like it's really driven in his rhetoric by a desire to reduce deficits explicitly, but we saw in his so-called skinny budget released earlier this year, it was really sort of a scorched earth budget, cutting almost everything except for defense spending. Do you see hypocrisy there?
Well, I think that one of the most interesting things about the legislative agenda that we've seen this year is the extent to which when cuts to government services become obvious, they become extremely unpopular. And we saw this with the effort at ACA repeal. This legislation has never been overwhelmingly popular with the American public. It's poorly understood and it's seen with a great deal of suspicion. The Republicans had really hung their hats on dismantling it. Well, when push came to shove and people were actually going to lose a government benefit that they recognized, it turns out that those things were pretty important to people and they were something people were willing to fight for.
So take us back. We were talking a little bit about the Boston Tea Party and some of the misremembrance there, but it's not an accident or a coincidence that there is a tremendous gap between how Americans feel about paying taxes and even about actually having their taxes increased, or about millionaires, for example, paying more, and where elected officials in Washington, but also in state and local government are and what they feel about whether it's actually kosher or something they can seriously seriously consider, let alone run on, to say that increasing taxes is part of what they plan to do. What got us there? How much of this is a story about Grover Norquist?
So I think that there's a strong, I was saying before that sometimes history is remembered through the present, and I think there is for the current generation of politicians, there's a very strong memory of a particular period in American history, the sort of Reagan Revolution, and particularly the Tax Revolt. This was an event that started in California with a very strong measure to cap property taxes, spread to other states, and it's had huge impacts on state budgets ever since. And I think people sort of viewed that moment as evidence that Americans are unwilling to pay for government services. They see government as wasteful, and they're just not willing to pay the bills. But what's interesting is since that period, so that was the late 70s and early 80s, if you look since then, there has been a steady increase over decades in the frequency with which voters at the state level have voted to increase taxes, right? So we see this, over time, a steady increase to when you reach the last 15 years, if you put a measure on a state ballot to raise taxes, you're as likely as not to see that measure pass, right? So voters confronted with the opportunity to literally raise their own taxes are taking that opportunity very frequently, right?
And actually more frequently than they did in the past. You find in your look back at the history on this.
That's exactly right. So there's been a real shift. And I think one thing that really matters is if politicians are willing to make the case for a tax increase to pay for something people care about, right? So I think there's some new evidence suggesting that if you put a tax increase on the ballot and talk about the fact that, at a state and local level, that money's going to schools, that money's going to hospitals and other roads, things that are just tremendously popular locally, people are willing to make a calculation and be like, I'll chip in a little extra for those services that I believe we need to have.
Well, and thinking about the state and local consequences of some of this, despite this broad willingness by the American people to pay more in taxes, even if it means they're paying more, not just other people are paying more, there is this just broad fear. We were talking before we started taping about my remembering back to my legal aid days in Philadelphia when the city was trying to figure out how to fund itself, and one of the ways that it started, and this is before Ferguson, one of the levers that they started to pull was aggressively going after largely low-income people, largely low-income Black and brown people in the city through fines and fees that these folks could not afford to pay, but that were basically a tax by another name for coming into contact with the criminal justice system. They were going to great lengths not to use taxes because of tremendous fear of what would happen to them at the ballot box.
Yeah, I think that is a real problem of not being willing to be honest about taxes, not being willing to trust the American people to be capable of having a budget and thinking about that and thinking about costs and trade-offs. I think we need to respect the citizenry a little more when it comes to taxes, particularly because when we don't, we end up with these kinds of consequences, these sort of backdoor tax systems that are extremely unfair, extremely regressive, and also, undermine what should be the primary responsibility of the police, which is keeping a neighborhood safe, and, turning them into sort of a tax collector by the back door. That's just it's not why anyone would join the police force. It's not what we want to see in our communities. And so I think that, if I could, make a recommendation to politicians at a state and local level, I think, have a little faith that you can tell your constituents, here's what we got to buy, here are the things we're going to spend the money on, and you can convince them that it's a good idea to spend that money. And not just in ballot measures, but you see it in surveys too. Americans are willing to vote for tax increases, are willing to say that taxes should be increased even on themselves for all kinds of major social priorities in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of infrastructure. I think that that's a case that you can take to the American people.
And of course, another context where this plays out on the regular is Social Security. There's this broad and widespread and across party lines and across income levels support documented by poll after poll that Americans are not just interested in strengthening benefits and expanding Social Security, which is wildly popular, but they're also willing to pay more in taxes to see that happen. And a piece of that obviously being raising or eliminating the payroll tax cap, which would mean that millionaires and billionaires would be paying in all year long, just like the rest of us, but people also willing to see their own payroll taxes increased. So I guess my question to you, in the final couple of minutes that we have is, how do we close that gap? How do we get to a point where people in Washington and particularly elected officials, but also elected officials at all levels of government, start to recognize that not only is raising taxes not politically toxic, but it's actually what their voters are asking for?
I mean, I think it's going to be a long conversation. I find it quite difficult to convince people here in Washington that, maybe give the American people a little more credit. But on the particular issue of the payroll tax, I think that's an excellent example, right? This is a tax that is frankly very expensive for working people, right? But it is also regularly the most popular tax that people pay. Now, how can that be possible? It's because people see the cost right there on their pay stub, and they see the benefit. They know that it's coming, and they think of it as a fair benefit because it's going to people who worked and chipped in, right? So it's kind of a miracle, and the way I talk about it in my book is sort of a miracle of tax infrastructure, that you've managed to make a tax easy to understand, and the benefits easily associated with it. And, when I asked people about, people remember the taxes on their pay stub as a general rule. They remember the payroll taxes. But when they talked to me about it, they didn't have much to say about the tax. They just wanted to talk about the benefits, right? So I think that you can create universal programs with broad-based tax bases to support them. And, when you do that, you create the most popular government programs we have. Social Security is the only federal program that I've found that gets the level of approval that you see for local services like schools, roads, and hospitals. The only federal program that's up there with those kinds of numbers is Social Security.